Okay, thank you everyone so much for attending Data Source Consulting's educational webinar series. We appreciate your time. Today's presentation is going to be on GDPR, also known as General Data Protection Regulation. And before we get started, just a few logistics, and also wanted to share the agenda with you. So the content is about 35-40 minutes in length, and then we're going to save the end of the presentation for Q&A. So please feel free to participate, and you can participate by typing in questions into that question section of the GoToMeeting, and then at the end of the presentation we'll be taking those one by one. So at any point, if you have a question, you don't have to hang on to it, just type it in there. Today's presenter is Nancy Kuchar, and I'll be introducing here shortly. And with that, let's go ahead and kick things off. So GDPR, last April, the European Parliament adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, like I mentioned, also known as GDPR. It is a European Union-wide regulation aimed at strengthening an individual's right to privacy and also promoting free flow of personal data. Now, this regulation, I'm sure many of you have seen it popping up in your inbox or in the news. It's getting quite a bit of attention in the US as well as worldwide, because if a company is doing business with Europe, then this regulation is something that they need to be paying attention to, as it has far-reaching effects. So today's webinar is going to provide you an introduction to GDPR. It'll describe the requirements, the deadlines, the penalties, and also focus exclusively on how to identify the opportunities to leverage a data governance program to support this regulation as it takes effect. So with that, let's go to slide 2. Let me give you an introduction to Nancy. Great. Okay, so Nancy Kuchar, she has a great deal of experience in this space, especially as it pertains to data governance. She's been a VP at United Healthcare as well as financial organizations. And you can imagine in financial and in healthcare how important a person's private and personal identifiable information is, especially in those two industries. So we're very excited to have Nancy be presenting today. My name's Deborah Langer. I'm head of sales here at Data Source Consulting, which is the enterprise data management arm of EXL Services, publicly traded on the NASDAQ. So with that, let's go ahead and let me do a brief introduction of Data Source. Next slide, please. So Data Source, why do we know about this? Why is it important to us? Why are we spending time to put together an educational series on it? Well, we focus exclusively on enterprise data management, and that includes many broad capabilities, but we're very focused on data. So it's broad, but it focuses exclusively on practices and expertise around data and analytics. So that would include data architecture, data integration, data quality, master data management, data governance, right, that we're going to be talking about today, cloud, hybrid cloud, big data reporting and analytics. And in our partnership with our parent company, EXL, we have now broadened our capability to align with predictive modeling, providing KPIs, machine learning, artificial intelligence to really bring our clients a very powerful end-to-end solution. So we're very excited about that. And we do that by providing both strategy as well as implementation services. So under strategy, you would find data governance, right? People, process, and technology, roadmaps, assessments, project plans, data environment evaluations, health checks, vendor tool evaluations when you're considering software to help you in your data maturity journey. And then implementation, we've got the engineers, the architects, the experts that have been working in this space for 15 plus years. So highly educated people in this space with a wonderful pedigree. So with that, that's our background. That's how you know that we know about what we're about to present today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy and have her take you through today's content. Nancy.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Deborah mentioned, the GDPR carries provisions that require businesses to protect the personal data and privacy of EU, which stands for European Union, citizens for transactions that occur within the EU member states. These member states there's 28 of them, and they're located primarily in Europe, making up a population of over 510 million people, so a very large population. The GDPR also regulates the exportation of personal data outside the EU, which explains this far-reaching impact that the regulation has and why you've probably seen so much about GDPR in the data management sites recently. The GDPR compliance deadline is May 25th, 2018, when it will fully replace the existing data protection directive that exists in Europe today. So while it is in EU law, it does have global applicability in that every company processing personal data of EU residents will have to comply and possibly be requested to demonstrate compliance on or after this deadline. This means any enterprise in the world that targets the European market by offering goods or services, or actually profiles or monitors their behavior in any way using data, will now come under the GDPR. Basically, GDPR compliance seeks to ensure that companies think about the data they collect, they focus on what they truly need, and they ensure that customers are aware of the data being collected. They're also held accountable for the manner through which they collect and store their data. Included with the regulation are additional citizen rights regarding the collection, the usage, and the distribution of personal data, and the empowerment of citizens to direct where and how their information can be used. So I'm sure it's the same for most of you. Over the years, companies have collected a vast and varied amount of personal data to manage customer relations, to feed their decision-based engines, and to gain valuable insights into their customers' routines, behavior patterns, and predictability. Now, all of this associated data's policies and processes will come under scrutiny as the GDPR, which has been considered the most expansive and impactful regulation to cover personally identifiable information, is being enacted. The traditional view of what was considered personal information typically included names, national identifiers, driver's licenses. I think back to how we first had to comply with HIPAA many years ago when I was with United Health Group, for example. And those were the types of things that we had to be aware of for PHI and PII. However, in recent years, this list has grown to include social media usernames, cookies, IP addresses, and a whole deluge of additional information that can uniquely and accurately identify or locate an individual. As a result, it's critical for organizations to understand their data landscape and to be able to identify and classify their data, its location, and its distribution in order to comply with the GDPR. As with many regulations, GDPR is lengthy. As a matter of fact, it contains 99 articles. and many of those are subject to interpretation. The good news is the provisions are consistent across all 28 EU member states, which means that companies just have one standard to meet within the EU. However, that standard is still quite high and will require most companies to make an investment to meet and to administer. Legal interpretation for your organization is important if you deal with EU individuals in any way. Listed here are some of the major areas of the regulation. Article 5, for instance, talks about all personal data must be processed lawfully and transparently. This particular phrase is repeated throughout the regulation and only for the purpose specified to the individual. Articles 6, 7, and 8 are really surround the concept of consent, indicating that each individual must give consent to use their personal data. Article 15, EU citizens have the right to know upon request what personal data a company is using and how it's being used. Article 17, the right to be forgotten and to data erasure. EU citizens can expect companies to stop processing and to delete their personal data upon request. So you can see the type of impact that can have on an organization, even knowing where that information and that data resides. Article 20 is the right to data portability, which means that EU citizens may transfer their personal data from company to company upon request. Articles 25 and 32, companies must be able to provide a reasonable level of data protection and privacy to EU citizens. However, the regulation has not made it clear exactly what that will mean from a standpoint of reasonability. Articles 33 and 34 indicate that companies must report data breaches within 72 hours, and 35 impact assessments indicate that companies must conduct data protection impact assessments. Articles 37, 38, and 39 refer to data protection officers. Some companies actually must appoint a data protection officer to oversee data security strategy and GDPR compliance. These are typically large companies that store large amounts of EU citizen data, process or store special personal data, regularly monitor data subjects, or are a public authority. And then Article 50 indicates that international companies that collect or process EU citizen data must comply with the GDPR, which is where it has the far-reaching impact into the US and other countries. And then the penalties are defined as well, which indicate that companies may be fined up to 20 million euros or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is higher. These are just some of the selected articles that have a biggest impact and ones you've probably seen or heard. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of content. I believe the size of the regulation is over 200 pages overall. So many surveys have been done around GDPR that indicate that most companies aren't prepared to be able to respond to GDPR. And these are some of the sample statistics that I've seen in some of the surveys. As you can see here, 39% of respondents say their organizations can't accurately identify and locate the type of data that would be in scope for the GDPR. For example, serious violators should expect to pay, as I mentioned, up to the greater of 4% of their global annual revenue, or 20 million euros in fines, which is equivalent to approximately 23.5 million US dollars. So, what are some of the things you can do to take action? The first thing is the data protection officer. If your company is large enough, many organizations impacted by the GDPR will need to appoint a data protection officer who will be responsible for defining the procedures and to ensure compliance. Next, check your procedures. GDPR requires documented procedures for many things, including defining the legal basis for using data you acquire, delivering privacy notices, acquiring explicit consent when required, managing access to data by users within and outside the company, handling requests by customers and other data owners to review, correct, delete, or share their data, assessing security and the impact of any data breaches, training employees and handling the data, and building privacy considerations into system designs. With some notable exceptions, GDPR generally avoids specifying the process details. Instead, puts the burden on the companies to demonstrate that their processes are suitable. So the first step is in meeting the standard is going to be to make sure that you have documented processes for the regulators to assess. The third area is to meet technical requirements. So GDPR does have some specific requirements, such as responding to customer complaints within 30 days, or sharing or erasing customer data on request, or keeping records of who sees which data and reporting breaches within 72 hours. Other capabilities, such as data classification, encryption, centralized customer data management, may not be specifically or explicitly specified, but are almost always going to be needed in order to comply with the GDPR requirements. Most organizations will need to do a detailed technical assessment of their systems and determine what changes they need to make in order to comply. And then also define a governance structure. So compliance with GDPR will clearly be a moving target as regulatory rulings clarify what's expected, as best practices evolve, and as technologies change to support the GDPR requirements. A governance structure will help to ensure your processes keep up with the changes, since GDPR touches the legal, compliance, human resources, training, IT, insurance, security, procurement, marketing, communications, pretty much almost all departments in an organization. All of these parts of the organization must be engaged in the governance process. And this is one of the reasons why governance is an ideal approach to start engaging, because it does naturally provide a structure to bring people from all parts of the organization together. Interestingly, as you can see here on the slide, many of the key points of GDPR align to the goals of data governance. In general, these regulations make it vital that an organization be able to identify their data footprint, classify data, hold people accountable for the quality, transparency, and knowledge around their data. GDPR requires organizations identify and provide traceability as to which classes of data are flowing through which systems, reports, and business processes. This is also a key requirement of data governance and is delivered through things like data lineage and impact analysis. Another piece of GDPR refers to policies, controls, and usage rights. These capabilities can be delivered through data governance policy management, usage matrices, and a collaborative knowledge base, for example. Like any new regulation, GDPR can be perceived as yet another regulatory hurdle, bringing with it additional costs and overhead. And we've had a number of these over the course of a few years. As I mentioned before, I've been involved in HIPAA, in SOX compliance, in CFPB, in PCI, and I know there are many more depending on the industry that you're involved in. And GDPR isn't really industry specific. It really is around personally identifiable information for anyone who you may have in your data. Even if it's external data that you bring into your organization, it could possibly have this type of data in it. So the vast majority of the regulation is truly something, from my perspective, that should have been common sense for a long time. As I mentioned, some of the the regulations that have been in effect over the course of time has impacted organizations in multiple ways so that they would begin to assess and implement an enterprise data management framework. And some of these were well over a decade ago. Although many of these focused initially on the technology, many organizations today now understand that the business contribution is equally, if not the more important facet to ensuring good governance and regulatory controls. Again, another reason why data governance is an ideal path to start ensuring that these types of regulations are governed and maintained. As such, GDPR can be perceived as an opportunity to develop or to validate the importance of data governance and data management. Having a strong data governance capability in place will also enable organizations to react more flexibly to future regulations. Starting up or enhancing your current data governance capability has many benefits beyond assisting with GDPR compliance. Data governance enables your organization to more readily know and understand the data available, how it's accessed and used across the organization, what your information and your data means, and how the organization can benefit from it. When thinking of data governance, many people think of things like standard business language, business glossaries, and data quality management. All of these are valuable aspects and valuable focus areas for data governance, and many organizations start with these areas when beginning a data governance program. However, data governance can be expanded to include focus areas such as access and security, the development and enforcement of standards, and regulatory compliance. These focus areas are the ones that can support regulations such as GDPR and ensure that there's continued review of impacted areas. If your organization doesn't have a data governance capability, it's important to start. I'm sure that there will be more reasons where you'll be happy you've started. The roadmap for initial discovery to business as usual, as you can see on this screen, is vital to ensure a data governance program that's right for your organization. So, although data governance is not the total solution to GDPR compliance, a solid data governance capability can pave the road to a smoother compliance roadmap. Okay, and I will hand it back to Deborah.
Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate that. We have had a number of questions come in. One of the first ones that we wanted to ask was, with GDPR, let's say today your company is not doing business in Europe, but looking down the road, there could be a possibility that they would be doing business there. Would you recommend that they should prepare for that now? Or is that something that you would recommend that they wait until they actually have European clients?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of answers to that one, Deborah. As a matter of fact, the first thing that I'd say about that is organizations should be careful to think that they're not impacted, because even small companies may end up with personal data from Europeans, given the expansive nature of this particular regulation. As I mentioned, even things like bringing in external data, which so many companies do in order to do benchmarking or market analysis and things like that, there could be some impact that an organization may not necessarily even be aware of. Another thing is, and I'll just equate this to something like CFPB, where an organization reaches $10 billion and all of a sudden they're covered under that regulation. I've seen and experienced this, where then all of a sudden there's a flurry of activity that has to happen because they're suddenly part of it and they weren't before. So if there is an opportunity to gradually move in this direction, the thing about GDPR is that many of these regulations reflect good practices anyway. Regardless, it's an opportunity for the organization to take a more structured approach to bring governance to the forefront to ensure that compliance and policies are part of their governance program.
Thanks, Nancy. That's super helpful. Question number 2, a few slides previously, the title of it was Data Governance Roadmap. And underneath the discovery portion, it mentions the importance of an EDF. And I wanted to ask if you could please elaborate on EDF, what that stands for, and what that means in case there are people in our audience who are not familiar with that.
Oh, sure. So an EDF is an enterprise data framework. And this is actually a tool that we developed as part of a data governance initiative, working at a client site to understand what the key data domains from a business perspective are in an organization, then drive to the next level of detail from a standpoint of subject areas and derive business definitions around those domains and subject areas. Once you have an enterprise data framework drafted, such as that, then you have the ability to map things like your applications, your data domains. Eventually, you can map data stewards to those domains if you are structuring a data governance program, and you can leverage it to and flesh it out to actually understand impact analysis over the course of time to your systems and to your data across the organization. So an EDF is similar to some of the things that I've done in the past to create just an enterprise wide picture of both the business and the data aligned to the business to ensure that it's a first step to ensuring that your data governance organization, for instance, has visibility into where they may need to focus if a regulation like this comes into play.
Thanks, Nancy. Super helpful. Thank you for that explanation. Another question that has come in is, are there governing or certification bodies that come in once the deadline takes effect to basically rubber stamp or certify that you are officially compliant?
There will be. GDPR will actually, there will be that, gosh, I can't think of the word. There will be that, I guess, possibility that any organization across the US could end up being audited for GDPR and will have to comply.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is let's say a company is doing business here in the United States and they have a customer move to a European Union area. Are they still obligated and subject to GDPR regulations, even though they're not necessarily marketing to clients or customers in that area?
If they have any data that is personally identifiable data to any individual that resides in the European Union, then they are subject to GDPR regulation.
Okay. I can imagine, when I think about some of these larger organizations, how important a tool would be to be able to look at data lineage, where the data is coming from, in order to support the right to be forgotten. Now, if you're a smaller company and you may not have the budget or the funding, right, to support some enterprise grade tools that can help you meet that compliance, do you see ways that people can support the right to be forgotten through manual processes, or do you feel like tools are critical?
honestly, I'm sure people will figure out ways to do it, Deborah. but I do think that the right tools are going to be critical, and there are a lot of vendors and organizations across, that I've seen that are starting to offer various tools to support GDPR. When you think about it, just identifying and assessing all of the personal data in the organization alone would require tools to enable that type of tracking and controlling. I mean, I'm assuming if an organization is small enough and the quantity of data they have is small enough, they may be able to query and manage it that way. But for the most part, many data quality and data governance tools that align to tools that they may be using for enterprise data management today anyway are starting to include the features that'll be needed. Things like data discovery, data profiling, deletion management, policy and process management, things like that. So finding the right tools, I think, things are going to shake out over the course of time. There are going to be a lot of tools available because this is going to be a key focal point for a lot of organizations between now and May and even beyond. But those tools will start shaking out. I wouldn't be surprised to start seeing some evaluations of them going forward, things like magic quadrants around these type of tools.
Thanks, Nancy. What approach or resources would you recommend with respect to creating a sensitive data framework in order to begin to classify your organization's data? And let me read that. Let me read it one more time because I know it's kind of a long question. So again, what approach, so they're asking for the approach and or resources would you recommend with respect to creating a sensitive data framework in order to begin to classify your organization's data?
All right, I'm thinking about that. I mean, I guess at a high level, much of this is similar to things that many companies have had to do in the past to some degree. Again, tools are going to be important to be able to identify the data. Creating most organizations have, security, they have chief information security officers, they have parts of their organization that are already in tune with understanding data security issues, and a lot of what GDPR is recommending is to ensure that you're protecting individuals' information securely. Because it isn't well defined, one of the things mentioned earlier is if you are a large company, having a data protection officer is going to be important. I think, for the most part, if you are going to be under the guise of GDPR, it will be important to have specialists in your organization, whether they're a DPO or part of an existing role, to ensure that you understand what all those regulations are. As far as the approach and the resources, Deborah, I don't know if that's something that we can post as an after commentary, because it might take a little bit of time to sort of work through what that actually would be.
Got it. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks. I know that's it's a detailed question. This next one, I really love this question. I think it's so insightful. So the question is around the word resides, right, as opposed to citizenship. So their question is, if a U.S. citizen is residing in the European Union, are they subject to, does it subject the company to GDPR guidelines?
That is a good question.
Yeah.
So, and that I think is going to be subject to interpretation for a while. I have seen two comments in GDPR, one indicating protecting the personal data and privacy of EU citizens, and the other is companies processing personal data of EU residents. So I think that's another area where it's going to have to be fleshed out and made much more clear as time goes on. In another part of the GDPR, it says protecting EU citizens and residents against the unlawful use and dissemination. So, you know, what it looks like is that it is definitely, you know, covering both citizens and individuals who reside in the European Union. I think with most of these types of regulations, it is going to take a little bit of time to flesh out, and there will be a lot of, I think, you know, findings that come out by organizations or by individuals that deep dive into the regulation over the course of time.
Thanks, Ann.
Deborah,
go ahead.
One other thing I'll mention, and I didn't think of this earlier, but our parent company, EXL, actually does have an approach that they've documented as well that describes sort of how to address GDPR. How do you ensure you have a framework and policies and procedures that support GDPR? So we can publish a little more around that as well as far as the EXL capabilities, because I'm sure that'll be a good example for others.
Yeah, so maybe when we post this on the website, we can add some of the more detail to that. We've got a number more questions to get through here, Nancy. Next question is GDPR set, or is it still being revised? You know, with like healthcare, how it went from ICD-9 to ICD-10, and it just every few years it got more and more granular, the requirement. Is GDPR set, or do you feel like it's still in possible revision mode?
So my understanding is that GDPR, which will be in effect on May 25th of 2018, has been defined. However, all regulations, I think, over the course of time do get tweaked and modified. I don't believe that'll happen before May, but I do think there's going to be a lot of clarification on it from a standpoint of what does some of the terminology mean. So, for instance, when they talk about you know, things like ensuring that all personal data is processed lawfully and transparently, you know, what exactly does that mean? You know, when they're referring to the ensuring that the company is storing information securely, exactly what does that mean? Some of these things refer to a term like reasonable, where there is going to have to be more clarity over the course of time. Whether that will imply tweaks and modifications to the GDPR, or whether it'll be more interpretations that individuals make and that it ends up getting clarified, I think either one could happen.
Yeah, good point. I mean, you can see, you know, just in some of the examples that you gave, how many of those words can be subject to interpretation. So, yeah, I can see where there can be a lot of push back and forth.
Right.
Next question, how far into the backup and archive history does the right to be forgotten apply?
My understanding is pretty much all the history. So if an individual requests that they want their personally identifiable information removed, that means all of it.
Wow. So even if, say, you've been in business 100 years and you have a client that is, you know, in their late 80s. You have to go all the way back and take care of that data. Is that correct, as you understand it?
Right, which is one of the reasons why there's been so much hype about this.
Yeah, it's not simple by any stretch. Next question. This person, their understanding is that there is a process to excuse an organization from GDPR based on your impact, or the impact, I assume that they mean to that person. Can you elaborate at all on this process to excuse, or what that might mean?
That I'm not familiar with, Deborah. I'm sorry.
No worries. I know that some of these are pretty detailed questions. So what we'll do for the person that asked that question is we'll post that answer once we get it next to the webinar, so that webinar recording, so that you can have access to that answer. So, okay, next one is, how is a company supposed to demonstrate that it has used the best possible technology to protect the data?
Actually, I think what's going to need to be demonstrated the most is going to be policies and procedures. The technology will support those policies and procedures. So, you know, at the point where an organization may end up being reviewed and audited for GDPR compliance, what they're going to have to provide is going to be proof that there are policies and procedures in place. And then I would expect, although I haven't seen exactly how they're going to approach the audit type of process yet, but I would expect, similar to what's done for other regulations, is that they're going to, you know, want to be able to actually see proof of that as well. And so the technology piece of it would have to support those policies and procedures.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, we're going to take one more question as we're coming up on our 45-minute mark. Is it true that a company can keep the data if they remove the identifier of the data? So let's say it's obfuscated, it's encrypted, it's masked, it's all three of those things. Is it possible that that a company could be not held responsible if that information is no longer identifiable?
Well, I think this is still a little bit subject to interpretation, but my understanding of it is, if you have any personally identifiable information, even if it is encrypted, even if it is obfuscated in some way, shape, or form, that is still something that, if another entity gets a hold of it, could possibly hack it, break it, whatever the case may be. So, so really, it is only if the data that you have has no personally identifiable information that it would not come under scrutiny.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Okay,
Sure.
With that, I apologize. I know we've got a few more questions, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll try and get those answered and either share them with the registered attendees or put them on the website. So I want to thank Allison, the organizer, as well as Nancy for her presentation. And if we could just scroll to the next slide real quick. I did want to send out a personal invite to everyone that's on this webinar. If you're interested in reference data management and how it relates to master data management, as well as the maturity of your data environment and the criticality of it, please join us on Friday, November 10th at 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We would love to have you attend that educational series. And with that, Nancy, thank you so much for all of your work. I thought that this was very informative. I know I certainly took some notes, and appreciate everyone's time. We'll share out the recording in case you have colleagues or that would like to listen to this material, or if you would like to review it again, we'll make sure that we share that. So with that, thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.